So Islam undercurrents, the undercurrents amongst the Muslim slaves, they were there. I don't also believe that all of them were perhaps awliya or imams and so forth, but they perhaps led the others in prayer. And because they led others and they taught others, they were honored when they died.
So that was the beginning of very hostile relationships between the Khoi and the Dutch. And these relationships have persisted pretty much to this day. This is why we today face such a challenge to get along in the same country. It's because of this very long history. Now what the Khoi did is they practiced what you call guerrilla warfare. The men went up this mountain that is behind me, the Khurikama, or what is today known as Table Mountain. And there's lots of plants up there, lots of animals, and they'd live up there and they'd come make forays into the colonial settlement, the castle and the lodge, and the around Strand Street and Adderley Street. What they practiced would be what is called economic warfare, because in their culture, when you spoke about a war, it didn't mean killing other people. They were a very non-violent culture. It meant intimidating other people into submission. So they would do things like they would burn the houses of the Dutch. They would take away their cattle. They would burn their fields. What they were trying to do was to make it impossible for the Dutch to stay here. Another way of putting it is they tried to raise the price of colonialism so it would just be very, very expensive. And indeed it was very expensive. The slaves also helped by doing very similar things of economic warfare. They weren't in a position to openly resist because they would get beaten up or even killed. But they would do things like they would work very slowly, they would act like they didn't understand instructions, they would sabotage machinery. You know, they spent 200 years trying to make slavery not profitable. One of the most interesting things about slavery in the Cape was the fact that slave women had a very low rate of reproduction. Throughout the period of slavery, the slave population never reproduced itself. They were constantly dependent on imports of slaves in order to keep the population up. Now, whether that was due to there's certain medicinal herbs that grow in this mountain, or how it came about, but the fact is that no slave woman ever had more than 2 children. And in that sense, they made slavery very expensive. So you can see how the roots, both of our problems, but also of our solutions, began in those very early years, and how it comes out of that particular history.
You first have the slaves in the lodge. All the company slaves, they were housed in the lodge, the slave lodge. Then there were the patrician slaves. Those were the slaves that belonged to the company officials. They were not supposed to have slaves, but they had slaves. And lastly, most of the slaves at the Cape were owned by the settlers in Cape Town, the farms around Cape Town, and in the rural areas. So what were they doing? First and foremost, they had to clear land for farming. And one of the most arduous tasks that the slave had at the Cape was the making available 2 commodities. The one was wood for domestic use for the fires, wood for the bakeries, and the other commodity was water. Water had to be carried from the streams before they established fountains, before they brought about the gracht, like we have here in Gracht. A gracht is a canal, like in Holland, and we have Buitengracht. Those were the boundaries of the town at that time. So in these grachts, they would have their water supply, both for domestic use and in the case of fire. Then later on they had fountains all over the town. But in many cases, slaves had to carry water over long distances. Slaves had to collect wood from as far away as 12 kilometers, 12 to 20 kilometers, they had to walk to gather wood. Because by then, 1806, most of the forests around Cape Town had been cut down. So that was always in demand before coal came into the colony. These, I would say, labors were performed by the slaves. And then in addition they had the arduous task of carrying human waste in wooden tubs from the residential areas to the waterfront and to Roggevai area.
The language of Afrikaans. If you look at the map, you'll see Arabic script. But in actual fact, it's the language of Afrikaans. And the language of Afrikaans emanated from the multitude of cultures that came from these areas, all these areas. And that is why today I can say, I come from everywhere.